Sue Gray has resigned as the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. Will this help or hinder Keir Starmer's attempt to get a grip on his government? The Tories held their conference in a strangely buoyant mood last week. We'll be taking a look back at what happened in Birmingham. And today, 7th of October, marks the first anniversary of that awful terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas. As the horrific aftermath continues and escalates, we ask what can be done to bring an end to the bloody Middle East conflict. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just a sort of bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Well, welcome back to the Den, and I'm joined as ever by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips, and we'll be discussing Labour, the Tories, international affairs, much more besides. And let's start with that sensational news that came out yesterday that Sue Gray has resigned her post as Chief of Staff, Keir Starmer. It's a story that's been rumbling on for a number of weeks now. Clearly, some unhappiness in the camp at number 10, with you've probably got politicos who've been embedded in the Labour Party for many years, including Morgan McSweeney, who's subsequently been named as Sue Gray's successor, alongside a woman whose career has basically been in the civil service. And I think the criticism that people from the outside looking in would make, personality clashes aside, is that she maybe didn't have that political instinct that one needs in that particular role. Joe, you've mentioned Sue Gray on a number of occasions. I think you felt like I did, initially, that this was all fluff and nonsense, but clearly there was something to those stories that emerged right throughout the summer, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you've put your finger on it absolutely, Frank. She was not a political creature. And I think because we've already said on this programme, all three of us, several times, that neither is Keir Starmer, that you've got to have somebody who's got that political nous. That, street fighter is it's a lazy piece of shorthand, but you've got to have somebody who's willing to take the fight. And the other thing that emerged yesterday in the news of her resignation was that she was in control of the grid. Now, for people who don't know, the grid is basically the diary of what's happening. What are the announcements? What are the focuses? What are the, visits, photo calls, and all the rest of it? Now, to give that control to somebody who is neither a journalist nor a political person is absolutely bonkers, because what's happened is we've gone completely off grid, and all we've been talking about is Wahid Ali, free suits, holidays, and pensioners' winter fuel payments. So I think it was never a question of if, it was always a question of when, whether or not this job, which sounds decidedly made up and part-time, will turn out to be nothing more than a temporary gardening leave until she's elevated to the House of Lords. Only time will tell. But I hope
she's been given as ambassador, I think is the word.
Nations and regions.
To nations and regions.
Yeah.
I think this is partially as a result of her apparently really good relationship with Andy Burnham and some of the mayors. And there was a letter apparently penned by Andy Burnham supporting Sue Gray. He attempted to get other mayors to sign the letter. I think he failed in that. But there does appear to be a genuine interest from Sue Gray in terms of that regional agenda. So we'll see. We'll see. But Jim, it's not a particularly good look, is it? When you look at what's happened within the first 100 days of the new government, and it was always our fear, I think, that Labour had come, I think it was described, wasn't it, as a loveless government in terms of the way it was elected, because they played that Ming Vase strategy for all it was worth, allowed the Tories to totally implode. But then, of course, they haven't got a massive amount of goodwill to draw upon when they take office, and it's all unravelled very quickly. So as much as Joe and I think, are fair in saying that Sue Gray wasn't the political animal you perhaps need in that role. The question will be, why didn't Keir Starmer see that in the first place?
Yes, the big issue here is that the country, after years of Tory psychodrama and instability, we're looking, especially with the majority of that sort, to 5 years of relative calm and stable government. And we've had quite the opposite in the first 100 days. And people must be wondering, when on earth is it ever going to end? Because it is a very unfortunate thing, to put it at its least, that you have to lose your chief of staff so quickly after coming into office. One could have thought that somebody could have put a lettuce in some TV studio to see how long she was going to last. So, from that point of view, in the macro sense of things, it is quite serious. As I understand it, as Joe said, she was of a civil service mentality and found it difficult to work with the hordes of incoming political staff, SPADs and people like that, special advisors to ministers. And I think she or whoever did put them on lower salaries, which caused the salary row to explode. But there was a lack of chemistry between the sort of way she was running the number 10 and the way in which all these political people did. And it's a truth, and I know Joe and yourself will agree with this, that you've got to be political in government. It's not just a question of policy, and it's something that Starmer's going to have to learn pretty quickly. That unfortunately it's a political environment where things are happening, people have emotions, ambitions, and you've got to make the lot tie together. I
think the wider point, Jim, is that with that lack of political instinct comes problems that we haven't even talked about on this podcast or mostly in the media generally. And it's things like, all of those new MPs that have been elected have not yet been invited into number 10 Downing Street. Now, a chief of staff with politics in their DNA gets that job done really, really quickly. And I think it's just those little small touches that begin to win you the confidence of the people who have been elected to represent the Labour Party, but probably you don't know them from Adam, and they only know you because you are the Prime Minister. They're the sort of relationships you've got to build from the off. And of course, if you have been somebody who's been involved in the Labour Party machine for 14 years of opposition, gone through really tough times, and you see this civil servant on a huge salary who you don't think is up to the job, then inevitable, I would say, was her exit. I think it's a bit sooner than we all expected. But then I would say that Johnson ought to have got rid of Cummins far sooner than he did. Remember the Rose Garden? Dominic Cummins, just to remind listeners, was the chief of staff who got himself into trouble going all the way to Barnwell Castle for an eye test during the COVID lockdown. My sense, Jim, is although it is quick, better to rip the plaster off now.
Yes. I mean, one other thing, as you've mentioned, Johnson, I was struck in an interview that Johnson did on Friday on ITV, where he kept on saying, "Oh, Sue Gray, what happened to her after she shafted me over Partygate? Oh, she went to lead the Labour Party." Now, I don't know what you guys think about that, but she always had a target on her back from the Tories, admittedly in an enfeebled party, so we shouldn't overrate their influence. But they were incensed and felt it was somewhat improper that she went from doing that Partygate investigation, which I have no problem with at all, but then to leap over and be ahead of Starmer's team was always going to put a target on her back. Just on this nations and regions thing, it's very interesting to hear what you say. I had a different take on it, but I've heard what you've said, Frank, about her relationship with Andy Burnham, and that's a positive. I just thought, they had to give her something, so they disrespect the regions again by just giving her this job before she goes off to the House of Lords. But you may be right; she may be interested in devolution. It's a subject that I look forward to seeing the bill on devolution that's going to be coming out, because there's a lot of important things happening, particularly in the northwest of England and elsewhere. But I think that target on her back was always a burden, and she'd have to overperform in order to establish herself, which she was unable to do.
But
My
I think
view of this is, sorry, Joe, my view of the initial appointment is that it was a clever move by Starmer, because having been out of office for 14 years, I thought that her job was to go in and work alongside a political team to advise them on how the machinations and mechanics of government worked, but would take more of a backseat when it came to that day-to-day running of the Prime Minister's office. As Joe said, who's in charge of the grid? Well, absolutely not somebody like Sue Gray. And I thought that it was a bit disingenuous of the Tories, and Johnson in particular, to say, well, she stitched me up, because he actually appointed her. So
yes,
she was doing that job, a job she didn't wish to do, and she basically reported back on the facts, which he is now sorry. He apologised. He's sorry. He said sorry, which shows you what a tosser he is. So I wouldn't necessarily criticise that decision by Starmer, or indeed Sue Gray, for taking the position. I do wonder, though, Joe, irony of ironies, Simon Case resigned this week as well. He's the head of the civil service, the most senior civil servant in the country. And would that have been a better job for Sue Gray?
well, probably yes. But of course, you know, she couldn't go for that unless she reapplied, and that would be very difficult. I mean, I think, you know, Simon Case has got an awful lot of baggage and is quite often had the finger pointed at him for leaks and not being neutral. But if you think back, I mean, somebody said over the weekend, if you think back to the days of Tony Blair, Jonathan Powell, who came in as in the sort of the Sue Gray equivalent, nobody had ever heard of him. Nobody knew about him particularly. And it's only in the latter years that we have known more about, you know, his role in the Good Friday Agreement and various other things, particularly foreign affairs. I mean, the fact that everybody knew Sue Gray, and I'm like you, Frank, I thought, what a smart appointment, how clever. But it may be, and let's hope so, that because she knows how government works, if she hasn't, you know, shot her bolt with all the government departments, that actually that would make sense for devolution, because that's where it gets bogged down, you know, whether it's in housing or planning or, you know, and the need for that's joined up between government departments. I mean, one would hope, and I think, you know, this is one other takeaway from this, is that by making a decision quickly, relatively quickly, some would say too slowly, but as you say, better than the Dominic Cummings thing that rumbled on, it does show the ruthlessness and the steeliness, if you like, of Keir Starmer, which I think some people quite like, but they have really not got very long to get a grip on things. And I was listening to Alistair Campbell this morning, who I thought had a really interesting point on this. And he said part of the problem is that previous incoming governments have all done a budget within 8 weeks. Yep. You know, 5 weeks for Thatcher, 6 weeks for Gordon Brown, 8 weeks for George Osborne. And this 4-month hiatus with so much hanging on the budget has really been a vacuum of their own making, coupled with, you know, the freebie gate stuff, but also the premature announcement about winter fuel allowance. Premature in the sense that it should have come in a budget, and maybe the budget should have been sooner. And what we're seeing now in the Sunday papers was, you know, that Rachel Reeves is now rowing back on taxing pensions because it would hit teachers and nurses and public sector workers. And now, you know, maybe rowing back a little bit on non-dom, maybe rowing back a little bit on the 45% band for equity release. So, you know, there's a whole load of things going on that adds to this sense of, well, did they know what they were doing? And they really need to get a grip. So I hope with James Lyons, who's the new head of
yes. Yeah.
Who is, you know, got a very good track record. Jim and I both know of him or know him. You know, Sunday Times, Mirror.
He's been appointed as the new director.
Yeah, and we must pat ourselves on the back, because all three of us in blogs and on this podcast for weeks have been saying the importance of making this appointment.
Yeah.
With no disrespect to the guy who's sort of does the lobby brief, Matthew Doyle.
Well, I do think that Joe has hit the nail on the head in terms of the failure to get that budget done quickly has created an awful lot of space, a vacuum, and this hiatus in terms of not being able to move on from the winter fuel allowance debate, which then everybody hangs everything else onto. So you've had a free suit. What about the poor pensioners? You've been to the football match. What about the poor pensioners? People have been to see Taylor Swift. What about the poor pensioners? Had you had that budget and you'd had a whole collection of policies rolled out immediately, it comes back to that point that we've made previously, I think, that the Labour Party and most of us were expecting an autumn election and they just weren't ready. And, I think a bit naively have thought, well, August is always quiet. We can all go away on holiday, have a little relax, come back, have a jamboree and a celebration at the conference, and then we can have the budget. Well, it's totally and utterly backfired on them, Jim.
Well, the only thing, the technical thing about the winter allowances is that I understand because of the administrative burden of doing it, it had to be announced as an in-year move and not something for next year, which is most of the budget changes. That's the explanation.
But I think the thing is, Jim, alongside a whole range of other things that would have been announced in a budget, it doesn't get the attention that ultimately it's been given.
Well, we're used to elections when there's a big parliamentary hunk of time ahead of it. Normally, if it's October, you've got the Parliament sits all the way through the winter. If it's in the spring, the Parliament sits up until the midsummer. That's we haven't had a July election since 1945. There's no reason why Rishi Sunak should have made it convenient for the government. You're absolutely right. The only question I would have is if you'd had James Lyons, and by the way, I don't know him that well, and I don't know what our opinion is of whether he's going to be able to tackle this, because he's got to do what Alistair Campbell did, and say, look, mate, I've been one of you at the Sunday Times and the Daily Mirror, so don't try and give me any bullshit. I know the journalistic trade, and this is our message, and and getting on the phone. A bit of bullying Campbell used to do with editors. Is he that sort of guy? I don't know. And the question is, if he'd been in place, would he have, notwithstanding what you say, been able to manage this summer hiatus? I don't know that.
Well,
I don't think anyone could have managed it worse. Do you know him, Joe?
I know of him vaguely. I know him, from a long time ago in the lobby, but he also then went on to become director of comms for the NHS and did a lot of their comms during COVID. So he's been in the fire, if you like, and I think we often mention Alistair Campbell and hold him up as the master of things. There are other ways of doing it. You don't have to be a bully. You can do it in lots of other ways. And I'm not saying Alistair was a bully, but I think some people got on the wrong side of him. But I think there are ways of dealing with it, and you deal with the press through trust, actually, and through giving them access and explaining things and doing that. And to go back to your question, Jim, if James Lyons or anybody else had been in place, would they have got past Sue Gray? Because I think this is the problem, that even people who could see what was going wrong were not able to get to anybody else, whether that was Morgan McSweeney or Keir Starmer or Angela Rayner or Pat McFadden. They couldn't get past her to say, what the hell are you doing? Have you thought about how this looks? So who knows?
And now what? So Morgan McSweeney's now in place as Chief of Staff. You've got Lyons in as communications guy. You're going to have a new head of the civil service in, I guess, by January, February at the latest. So a reset in a sense. Budget's on the way on the 30th of October. Now, all of these moves at top level very much interest and excite geeks like us. But to the people out there, I said last night when the news came through, Sue Gray's resigned. And Vic said, didn't know anyone called Sue work for you. So, and my wife is far from daft. But they do follow this stuff the way that we do. Sue Gray is just a name. So the budget is still crucially important. The politics and this messaging that I keep getting fed back to me is they're all the same. That needs to be addressed and addressed quickly. And as much as we can say the comms have been poor, Sue Gray wasn't political enough, I do have this concern that the politicians themselves haven't been bloody political enough. I wouldn't have needed to have been told that it looked bad that I was accepting suits off an individual donor of the Labour
No,
Party.
exactly.
I wouldn't have needed to be told that announcing the winter fuel allowance cut in isolation was probably going to backfire. And I think that this lack of politics is starting to concern me. And I wonder whether some of the people who started to emerge as commentators, you've mentioned Pat McFadden, I noticed Peter Kyle, who's a really smart political operator, was wheeled out at the weekend. I think the government needs, I should say, better advocates than they've been putting forward thus far. And,
Yeah, absolutely.
again, I saw something on social media at the weekend from the Education Minister, Bridget Phillipson. A lot of time for Bridget, but it was just a daft tweet about private education, VAT being put. Well, we need this because we need more teaching staff before we need embossed letterheads for private schools. Well, we can't be getting into that class war thing.
No.
And I think that lack of politics within some of the cabinet is, as I say, it's starting to concern me.
Well, and I think, to go back to your point about not inviting the new MPs into Downing Street or having an away day or whatever you want to call it, a lot of those MPs will have been carrying the smaller Ming vases across their constituencies. And in a sense, it's a little bit like passing your driving test and then sort of thinking, oh, right, okay, I've got to stay at 30 miles an hour on a motorway, but whoops, I'm in the fast lane. Now everybody's hooting behind me and undertaking me. So I think, they need to get their confidence. The confidence will only come when the mistakes stop happening. And I think, above all, the public need to see some visible difference. And the government needs to say, look, we've sorted out the doctor's strike. We've sorted out the train driver's strike. We've headed off the teacher's strike. We've given public sector pay awards. So, we've got all of those people who should now be quite secure. We're going to do these things on maternity pay and workers' rights and all of that, which will help recruitment and retention. They need to be owning that narrative. But more importantly, people, as we go into the winter, the days are getting shorter, people are getting fed up. They need to see and feel a difference because it's only 3 months since the election, but that's a hell of a long time to have had this many mistakes. And unless you can think, oh gosh, they are building that new school, or I could get a doctor's appointment, or the buses have been taken back under, local authority control, or I'm not having to wait for hours to get my mother into a care home. All of those things, none of them can be fixed overnight, but they need to start doing things that will show people, and they need to have a real constituency target so that every one of those new MPs can go back and say, right, we've been in power for 100 days. This is what's happened in our constituency.
Yeah, but this is why
Starmer made an interesting point, Jim, during his speech of the week. He was out and about in a factory and he made an announcement, and there was a bit of pushback saying, well, wasn't this something the Tories were going to do? And he said, no, this was something the Tories talked about doing forever and never actually delivered. And what you'll get from this government is we will tell you about things when they're being delivered. Now, that is, in an ideal world, absolutely the right approach from government. The problem is, in this day and age, perception means almost everything. And if the perception in 18 months' time is where we are now, then I'm afraid Keir in 2 years' time saying, well, look at this that we're going to deliver, be too late because people will have switched off. He's got to start to get on the front foot, and they've got to start to get that political messaging out there. And as Joe said, whether it's going to be delivered tomorrow or in 4 years' time, those sunlit uplands have got to be explained to people. Those ambitions and the things that Labour want to deliver as a government need to be talked about now. You can't just wait until these things are delivered. It's too long.
Yes. Two things on that. The damage may already have been done. I mean, we've often talked about Liam Burns' note in 2010 that there's no money left, which helped to define the Tory critique of the previous Gordon Brown government. So it may be that the damage is already done and they've got a real mountain to climb. I suppose there is one last chance in the budget, and the budget is even more critical now, that Reeves has got to, as you say, pull all this together, create a narrative and start to deliver. And without that, they really will be in trouble.
And I keep saying, or a lot of people have said, well, they've got 4 years to sort this out. But of course, if you're a councillor, or if you're in the Senate, or if you're in the Assembly in Scotland, and interestingly, there were a couple of by-elections in Lancashire on Thursday, and in Lancaster, the Greens won the seat, and that means the Greens have now taken control of Lancaster Council. And in Blackpool South, does that constituency ring any bells? That was the last
Scott Benton.
Correct, the last by-election that Labour won. An excellent Labour candidate, actually, a guy called Chris Webb, won the seat in a by-election and then won a bigger majority still on the 4th of July. That by-election in Blackpool South went to Reform.
Oh, Reform.
Reform. And so this again, I think, demonstrates Labour's challenge, because you've got in Lancaster a party that you would, generally speaking, say is to the left of Labour, and in Blackpool South they've lost a seat to an extreme right-wing party.
But
so
I think what that tells you,
constituency
Frank,
in the middle together is going to be tough for them.
But it's people looking for something different.
Yeah.
And I think that is the real danger, as you said, about when people go, oh, they're all the same, and they put their head in the sand and they just hear freebie and, you know, chaos in Downing Street. They don't care about Sue Gray or Kemi Badenoch or whoever it is. They probably don't even know. But actually, you know, when you look at somebody different, well, we haven't tried this before. You know, you're going to go Reform, you're going to go Green. And we are only just over 6 months away from the local elections. So I don't think Keir Starmer has got very long. He needs to, by Christmas, people need to see the foundations. They need to see, if you like, the hoarding round the site and the cranes going up. They don't need more waffle. They need to actually see what's going on.
A little less conversation, a little more action, as
Yes.
the famous rock and roll singer once said. Anyway, listen, there's an awful lot for Labour to contemplate and to be getting on with in government. And of course, the opposition met in Birmingham last week. There was a rehearsal, or was it an audition? Sorry, not a rehearsal, an audition for the party leadership from the 4 remaining candidates. You will recall from last week, Jim Hancock was talking up James Cleverly's chances, and Mr. Cleverly did rather well at the conference before making an absolute prat of himself over an issue that we will discuss after this short break. And we'll also be looking at the terrible situation that is continuing to happen in the Middle East. Stay with us, we'll be back in a moment. On the 30th of October, Downtown in Business is hosting our Liverpool City Region Parliamentary Reception. We'll have lots of peers, lots of MPs, government ministers, leader of Liverpool City Council, many other officials from local authorities across the Liverpool City Region joining us. That's the 30th of October, Budget Day at the House of Commons. A few tickets remaining. Click on the link below. Book your tickets now. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, my colleagues Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. We've discussed all things Labour and the government in the first part of the programme. Now we're going to turn our attention to the official opposition and the Conservative Party, who held their conference in Birmingham last week, of course, and it was the audition for the leadership. 4 candidates remain: Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, Tom Tugendhat, and I was going to say Tom Cleverly. James Cleverly.
Be a great leader of the
James
party.
Cleverly. And somebody asked me last week, why do you keep talking about this Tom Cleverly? Who's Tom Cleverly? Tom Cleverly is a footballer, plays for Watford, was at Everton for a short period of time, and Wigan. And Jim referred to Tom Cleverly as the Tory candidate when this conversation starts on this podcast about 25 months ago, it seems, because that leadership contest has run and run and run. So I do apologise for listeners who've been confused by the reference to Tom Cleverly.
They needed a man of the people as a candidate. They could have easily, quickly made him a member of the Conservative Party, and all the charisma of being a footballer, there he would be.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, listen, two things I'd say about the party conference in Birmingham last week. Firstly, the Conservatives clearly in denial and totally buoyed by Labour's travails, I guess, which has given them some hope that they could potentially turn around this huge defeat that they suffered in July. Secondly, I felt that there was a feeling in and around conference that they weren't electing the leader who will fight the next general election, but the leader who will possibly take them through the next couple of years, while they find someone within the cohort of 120 MPs who might be able to make a better fist of it, or indeed, and this was something that a Conservative said to me, not necessarily supporting the idea, but one that was mooted around the conference hall apparently in Birmingham, wait for by-elections and get Boris back in. Unbelievable. And then he will lead us to victory at the election in 5 years' time. So, obviously, my warm words and analysis of the Tory conference have interested Joe's cat, but I'm going to start with Jim. Let's start with the auditions and the four candidates, because you said last week you thought James Cleverly still had a good chance of certainly getting on the ballot paper, the last two. He done really well, Jim, didn't he? Out of the four candidates, I think he had the best conference, and certainly his appearance on stage met with the most positive reception from delegates in the hall.
Yes, indeed. Just before I answer that, last night I was at an event in Cheltenham at the Literary Festival with Tim Shipman, who absolutely made your point. He was asked by Rachel Sylvester about Boris Johnson, is he still around? And he said he's never gone away. And so you're absolutely right to pick that out. And in his interviews for promoting his book, he clearly is keeping the door open. We're back to this, if the ball should emerge from the scrum stuff. So you're very, very right to alert us to that possibility. I mean, it's hugely problematic, but it goes to this point that one doesn't feel that they were in Birmingham actually thinking about the next prime minister, but to try, but what is the motivation? It's going to be absolutely crucial. Do the Conservative members, because they're going to play quite a crucial role in this, so the MPs are going to fillet it down to two. Do they actually want to come together and try and unite? And if they do, I think the appeal of James Cleverly last week, when he was going around the conference, will have resonated with them. And if he gets through, he will be the candidate to do that. Kemi Badenoch had a pretty disastrous week over maternity and putting civil servants in jail. I think all the worries that MPs had about her shooting from the hip were confirmed. Tom Tugendhat, I think he's just suffering from being neither one thing or the other. I mean, is he on the left of the party, but he wants to abolish the Convention on Human Rights?
Don't be a little bit pregnant, Tom. That's what somebody should have advised him.
That's right. But we can't ignore the slick campaign of Jenrick. His campaign in purely political terms as a political exercise has been extremely slick, and one would be surprised if he's not on the final two when the MPs have these double ballots tomorrow and on Thursday to choose the final two. So that was my take on the week in Birmingham, and of course the extraordinary spectacle of the leader of the opposition coming in on the Sunday in a cardigan, attending one fringe event and no speech at all. I know a speech would have been difficult, but it's quite. I can't remember. Maybe Joe can. Any circumstances in which the leader of a party has not made a speech at their conference.
No, I think it's absolutely astonishing, and I think it's actually quite rude and disrespectful to the party members. You've got to thank all of those people who did support you, who did do the campaigning. I know we talked last week about, canvassers and all of that sort of stuff. But I just think it's disrespectful. But it's no surprise. I mean, we know perfectly well why there was an election in July so the kids could start school in California in September, allegedly. Who knows whether that's true? But that was rumoured before the election was called. I think James Cleverly, your friend Jim, has now edged ahead, and it looks like it's going to be him and Jenrick for the top 2 places. But that, of course, is with the diminished number of MPs. It still goes out to the members, and don't forget the members gave us Liz Truss, and you can't trust these people.
And David Cameron. to reignite last week's row.
Absolutely.
Well, apparently not, Jim. Apparently a very, very different membership these days. So they didn't give us David Cameron. But anyway, come back to that in a bit.
They're never going to win the next election unless they recognise what went wrong in this one. And they're so busy fighting reform that they're actually not recognising that reform is, as Frank just pointed out, also chasing Labour. Reform is there. It's a different party. It may fizzle and die. Who knows? But they need to understand that, what went wrong and why people didn't vote for them. And until they do that, it doesn't matter if they had, the Virgin Mary taking them into the next election. They would still lose because there'd be somebody going, yes, but what about Europe? What about immigration? And we go round and round the same old tired arguments. And then somebody comes up with the idea of, I know, let's go back to pounds, shillings and pence and have the test card every night. That'll be marvellous. Go back to those old values. And you see Robert Jenrick with this ludicrous claim about British special forces that was roundly condemned by everybody who'd ever served in the army, former Attorney General and various other people. Tom Tugendhat, who seems to be saying, I was a soldier, which is a bit like, Keir Starmer's dad was a toolmaker. It's like, yeah, and what's your point? And Kenny Badenoch, who honestly, was it Dennis Wise they used to say could pick a fight in an empty room?
Yeah.
Well, I think she might be the Dennis Wise of the Tory party.
Yeah, it's a good analysis. Very short and sweet, but accurate. What surprised me was that there was nobody among those leadership candidates, Cleverly included, who wasn't prepared. And Tugendhat should have done this, actually. It was his job to do this. Listen, we lost 5 seats to Reform. We lost 75 to the Liberal Democrats. I think we need to have a more nuanced conversation as to where our future as a Conservative Party lies. And the fact that Tugendhat has failed to do that, I think, is shameful for him. Cleverly, okay, he's got a bit of a chance now. And I think, having looked at his performance, he was trying to come across as the new Ken Clarke, wasn't he? You can come and have a drink. I'm a bit blokey. He did actually make the point to the Tories, which I thought was a good one. We have to appear to be more normal. So he's acknowledging that they do look a bit weird from the outside looking in.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's the attack on the Republicans in the United States by Vice. Yeah, Kamala Harris is. It's very interesting. He picked it up from there.
Right, isn't he? Because Truss looks weird, doesn't she? And then, what makes the Conservative Party look weird is that they still have this huge admiration for Truss when the rest of the country just thinks she's fucking barn pot. I think Cleverly's problem, though, came almost immediately after the conference, and it's his track record, and it's him trying to basically say, let's ignore all of that I was involved in as Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary and Chairman of the party, and just concentrate on bringing us all back together and being mates. The right wing of the party are not going to allow James Cleverly to take the party to the centre, which I think is where he'd like it to be. They are now not obsessing necessarily over the European Union, but ECHR, which is just nuts again. Johnson, I think, was saying during a series of interviews promoting his book over the last few days, we should have a referendum. Well, fucking hell, we know how those go in the UK. And then the other thing that Cleverly said following the conference was this criticism he made of Labour handing back the Chagos Islands and giving up this territory. I have to say, I didn't even know we had. No, Jim probably went to the opening ceremony back in 1066, but I'd never heard of the place before. And then it emerges over the weekend and before, actually, that James Cleverly was leaving the negotiations to hand these islands back, quite rightly, because it's been found not once but twice in an international court that those islands should go to Mauritius. And so Labour governments are just basically finishing the job that was started by the Conservative government. Wasn't a particularly controversial decision, this. The big issue was the base, the military base that is on those islands. And Labour have negotiated a deal whereby for the next 100 years, that base is going to continue to be run by the United States, who have publicly expressed that they are comfortable with the deal. So Cleverly's not done himself any favours there, Jim, and was immediately attacked by his leadership contenders because they've all said, oh, it was on his watch that these islands were handed back.
Yes, it might have done a marginal damage. I mean, people don't really follow foreign affairs that much. So I think it's limited. I just wanted to say one thing about this. As I understand it, I mean, the Chagosian islets are about 1,000 miles south of Mauritius. They regard Mauritius as a sort of imperial power. And as I understand it, the Chagosians would quite like to be an independent country themselves. So they are incensed. And interestingly,
that controlled you.
Yes, indeed. Interestingly, the Labour MP for, of all places, Crawley, where apparently a large Chagosian community exists, was very critical of David Lammy. And we shall look forward to the performance of the Foreign Secretary at the dispatch box today. He's the weakest member of the cabinet, in my opinion, and he's going to have quite a rough ride. I know I haven't answered your question, but I've spent too much time with politicians.
I just, do you know what I really object to? And I think this is something that we should have foresaw and didn't. The fact that Sunak has just basically left the stage, and therefore, where we've had consensus for many, many years now in terms of these foreign affairs issues that often prime ministers have to deal with, and you get consensus around them. So there's lots of things that the Conservative government did in foreign policy over the last 14 years where I'm sure Labour felt not quite on the same page. Certainly over Gaza, for example, which would be much easier for Starmer to have taken a different position. But there's always that unwritten law, isn't there, within British politics, that on foreign affairs, then actually we're all on the same page because it's important that the UK is seen as united. And you've got these four absolute tossers who are putting their leadership chances before the country's interests. You know, I've even heard them criticising the Labour government's stance on Israel, which is no different than what Sunak would have taken if he'd have remained Prime Minister. So I was totally unimpressed with the four of them. I think that big consolation for Labour is, although they've made a bit of a horlicks of its first 100 days in office, they've still got a very, very weak opposition. And I don't think that you're going to have a leader, whoever emerges as the winner of this contest, who's going to be able to take that party, manage it, and bring it to a position where it's got a chance of winning the next general election.
Can I just make one final point? The travails of the government perhaps led to a rather strange euphoric atmosphere in Birmingham, which prevented the Conservatives, I don't know what Joe thinks about this, from actually doing the hard yard analysis of why they lost so catastrophically, as they were all sort of caught up in a euphoria thinking Labour are so bad we'll be back in office in 29. So it wasn't that forensic conference that they should have had. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely something. And perhaps that's Keir's tactic. Maybe he was lulling the Conservatives into a false sense of security in order that they just don't actually have the debate and discussion they need to have for the defeat. Anyway, sorry, Joe, I interrupted.
Well, no, only to say that, you know, I think Jim's I think that's a very fair point. But going back to the thing about Rishi Sunak, whether it was Rishi Sunak or whether it was the chairman of the party, Richard Holder or whatever his name is, who was the person who was going to say, right, let us do this forensic analysis. Let us look at where the Lib Dems are barking at our heels or the Greens are coming, breathing down our necks, and stop blathering on about reform and reminding everybody how much more attractive reform might appear to this quartet of people who don't seem to have, given that they've all been in government at one level or the other, you would think that they had a little bit of a grasp of detail. So you've got Robert Jenrick, who's got a comment on everything. He's like a phone-in, one of those regular phoner-inners. The government, the Prime Minister must stop the bill on assisted dying. No, he shouldn't. It's a free vote. It's a free vote on a private member's bill, and then there will be a lot of machinations to see how the law works. So shut up, Robert Jenrick. Tom Tugendhat, what's he got to say about it? Oh, I was a soldier. Well, that's nice. I'm sure you look lovely in a uniform. Kemi Badenoch, who manages to, amazingly, in one sentence, annoy businesses, trade unions, and 95% of working women. It's astonishing. And then civil servants should be in prison, presumably led there by Sue Gray, one former ex-civil servant. So cleverly talking about being normal and channeling, interestingly, I thought, his inner Ronald Reagan, who, of course, defeated Jimmy Carter because Reagan was Mr. Optimism, Mr. Hope, and all the rest of it, whereas Jimmy Carter, very presciently and way before his time, was warning about climate change and natural disasters. And of course, everybody, we don't want to hear that misery. So I don't think, whoever is there is not going to be the leader of the Tory party that goes into the next election if this Parliament runs its course. And just going back to the local elections, I think it's quite possible, but that by the time we get to the next election, we might be looking at the Liberal Democrats actually vying to be the official opposition.
There's certainly the opportunity for the Lib Dems, I'd have thought, to fill that space. Just final points on the Tory conference. We will come back to the Conservative leadership race next week and talk in a bit more detail, because we ought to know then who the final two candidates are in this interminable, lengthy fucking race that they're having for someone who probably will only be there 18 months, 2 years. Hopefully they'll last longer than Liz Truss lasted. There was no discussion at all, from what I could see anyway, in terms of the media coverage or indeed from conversations in and around the hall, of Baroness Wolsey's resignation from the Tory party, which we very briefly touched upon last week. And I've been criticised for not taking a bit more seriously one of the charges that Baroness Wolsey has aimed at the Tory party, which is Islamophobia. And I can only say that I had a heavy cold. Man flu, in fact, would be a more accurate description, and so ought to have discussed this issue a bit more than we did. And it was pointed out to me that there was a report undertaken in May 2021 of anti-Muslim views within local associations in particular, and the Conservative Party had a whole range of complaints made to it, which were upheld. And so the view that perhaps we appeared to make last week, that there was no Islamophobia in the Tory party, of course, was not true. And we had that awful comment that Boris Johnson made about, did he say Islamic women look like letterboxes, pillar boxes, something like that, and a whole host of other very, very unfortunate things that were said. So in no way, shape or form was I trying to underestimate that issue within the Tory party. Perhaps, I will give myself a slap on the wrist for not pushing back a little bit more. I think you have a view as well on this, Jim, didn't you?
Yes, well, that's a very gracious thing for you to say, and I must make my position clear. I used the word that is Islamophobia. The complaints about it were exaggerated. I also looked up this report. 2/3 of the complaints to the Conservative Party in that May 2021 report were about Islamophobia, and you referred to Johnson's letterbox insensitivity. The only thing I was resonating was the report went on to say However, issues of Islamophobia are not treated differently to other accusations of discrimination in the Conservative Party, and that the party was not found to be institutionally racist. So that's what it was actually said. But I think we should both take a little slap on the wrist.
Yeah, absolutely. And we acknowledge the fact that Baroness Wolsey had a case, not only as far as that was concerned, but Jim mentioned earlier, this membership, they elected David Cameron. Well, it was 14, well, it was 19 years ago. So that party membership looks very different now to what it did then. And I think even though Cleverly had a good conference, and as I say, we'll come back to this next week, I'm still not convinced that that party membership won't go for Jenrick and the sort of policy that he's peddling, which is, basically saying we should get Reform to join with us. That was the line that I thought he was taking last week. But as I say, we'll come back to that. Right, moving on, and it is today, 7th of October, the anniversary of that horrendous attack by Hamas on Gaza, where over 1,000 people were murdered. Lots of people, I think over 200, were taken hostage. There's still 97 people, actually, hostages who have not been returned to Israel. And there's lots of things happening today commemorating that situation. But more worrying, perhaps, is the fact that the whole conflict has escalated, and it seems that there is little that any of the big players, the United States, even put the United Kingdom into this category in a sense, but nobody, Joe, appears to be able to have a conversation with either side to say, can we stop this, have a ceasefire, and try and get round the table, have conversations? It's just going from bad to worse, isn't it?
It's awful. And if you think about it, in 1 year since that terrible attack by Hamas, which caught the Israeli security services and forces totally by surprise, which I think has been a hugely damaging thing. And also, I think it also caught the Americans by surprise, the American security forces services. But in the intervening time, Gaza is virtually flattened. Over 41,000 people have been killed. There have been bombs, there has been a lack of aid, there is no housing, there is no health service. The human destruction and the human misery that has been wrought over the last year, and as you say, Frank, is now spreading into Lebanon. While we have this absolutely horrific willy waving between Benjamin Netanyahu and the leaders of Iran, who of course back Hamas and Hezbollah. So you've now got this horrible game, in the middle of which, and at the root of it all, are ordinary people whose lives have been shattered. Netanyahu, if you remember, just over a year ago, millions of people were taken to the streets in Israel to protest against his extreme right-wing government. And there are many people in Israel who are still very unhappy with the way he has sought revenge and vengeance, but has actually not achieved anything in terms of getting the hostages back. And as you say, there are nearly 100 of them still in captivity, or at least missing. So, in a way, this has shored up his position, kept him out of prison, which he was facing on potential corruption charges. But it has also dealt a heavy blow to Hamas and Hezbollah, and it is spreading around the region. Biden's on the way out. Netanyahu doesn't give a damn what Biden says, nor Trump, nor Kamala Harris. They don't give a damn what David Lammy or his predecessor David Cameron said. And it's very difficult to see how you get to any solution. If you have the Prime Minister of Israel banning the Secretary General of the UN from going into that country, well, where does that leave you? And where does that leave you in terms of humanitarian aid and rebuilding these shattered cities, rebuilding these lives? And, what are you doing if not breeding and storing up resentment and hatred amongst the people whose lives, the innocent people whose lives have been completely destroyed. I think it's terribly, terribly dangerous.
And Netanyahu has used this conflict to his own political advantage, hasn't he? I mean, if you look at the aftermath of that 7th of October attack last year, then he was basically the most unpopular prime minister Israel had had in a long time. Well, fast forward, and polls are now showing that actually, if they went for an election tomorrow, his party would win. And I guess this is partly as a result of the fact that he has restored that confidence in the military. You know, Israel's military and defence has always been seen as the best or one of the best in the world. Very embarrassing for them last year when Hamas were able to undertake that terrible attack on Gaza. But subsequently, and as recently as a couple of weeks ago, we saw that incredible operation which the Israelis basically took out half of the Hezbollah leadership with these devices, these phone devices that just were blowing up. I mean, just, you know, whatever you think of the conflict, that was an incredible military operation. And on the back of that, Netanyahu seems to have been strengthened and appears to then have the confidence to say to Biden and any other of the individuals that have tried to basically urge upon him a bit more restraint, basically 2 fingers, you know, I'm not interested.
Yeah, that is the position at the moment. Netanyahu is strengthened. I do wonder. I mean, at the moment, Hezbollah are starting to send missiles into some of the major Israeli cities, and there's a huge contradiction in the support that he's getting, because he's not bringing peace and security to Israel. They're now being shelled in their major cities as well, and whether there'll be this is, you know, peak Netanyahu popularity, and people are saying, hang on a minute, we're not being guaranteed any safety because of this. But generally speaking, I'm very pessimistic at the moment. Where you've got an enfeebled American presidency, where you've got the Iranian proxy organizations just bent on destroying the state of Israel and not interested in any sort of peace talks. You've got Netanyahu not interested in creating a Palestinian state. I just think this is going to go on for a while. I do think the threat of an all-out war in the Middle East is somewhat exaggerated. For that to happen, and one other thing is the Israelis are taking an extraordinarily long time to decide what their response is. I mean, maybe the American pressure is slightly larger than we're suggesting, but you know, there's 3 things they could do: the nuclear sites, which really would ignite things; the oil fields, which I'd be surprised if the Israelis attack that, because that would affect, you know, Western oil supplies as well. So it's what they do proportionately. But I just think, you know, obviously if the Iranians then responded in a very aggressive way, the United States would become involved, and then you would have it. But I don't think there's a chance of that. In a sense, it's almost worse. It's just going to go on and on like this. And just finally, eventually, God knows when in the future, the Israeli government have got to recognize there has to be a Palestinian state. They have got to expel their settlers from the West Bank, and the Palestinian state can be demilitarized by international conventions and can be funded by the massive wealth of the surrounding Arab countries who want to do this. The Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians want to fund and create a prosperous Palestinian state. And then Israel can be safe behind its borders. That is the final solution to it, and probably Jerusalem, policed by the United Nations and available to all faiths. That is the final solution in Jim Hancock's arrogant and simplistic analysis. But I do believe that, but I do not see when on earth it's ever going to happen.
But the other thing is, while we're all looking there, we're not looking at what's going on in Ukraine. And I think that's the other thing. And the bit that bothers me about it, I mean, I hear what you say, Jim, and I think, you know, we are not on the brink of World War III, but I think, as Tobias Ellwood said last week, we are a world at war, which is quite a different thing. But when you have Israel attacking the Houthi rebels in Yemen, you know, that takes it way beyond. And if you think of those major shipping routes, through the Red Sea, and of course the Straits of Hormuz, which Iran controls. If you have a problem there, then America would have to get involved. And the reality is that, price of oil is fluctuating as this goes on. That's going to have an impact on things and the cost of them here at home. So, as is always the case with foreign affairs, war in a foreign country, Britain escapes.
We haven't heard from Russia and China particularly about the Middle East, have we?
No.
That seems a bit strange, and I'm taking on board your global perspective.
Well, China's been absolutely quiet, but I was doing a program last week with Robert Fox, the very venerable and fantastic veteran defence correspondent from the London Evening Standard, and the point that he made is actually what we need to be looking at is looking at what's going on in space. Who's controlling the satellite which gives the capability of the missiles that are fired from Iran into Israel that also happened in April are now speeded up because they've got that capability of accuracy. And I would just say on a final note, which may be conspiracy theory or not, who controls a lot of what goes on in space but that lovely man, Elon Musk?
Yeah. That's a frightening thought, isn't it? It's a frightening thought.
Terrible.
When you're talking about wars, and we've always been fearful of a nuclear war. When you start talking about what's happening in space, then it just tells you how far it's gone. And I couldn't agree more with your analysis, Jim, in terms of what that final solution looks like. But we do seem to be a very long way away from that, I'm afraid. And we can only hope and pray that things will resolve themselves, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I don't want to end on a depressing note with our podcast this week, so I'm going to go back to our old friend who always gives us a chuckle, and that is Boris Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, who has brought out a work of fiction in time for Christmas. People are interested in fictitious books and buying a gift for somebody who enjoys a load of bollocks. Talk about revisionism in terms of the book, in terms of the extracts I've made myself read. But there was a little controversy last week as he took to the various media studios to basically exonerate himself from any blame from anything that went wrong in his government during the time he was Prime Minister, or indeed when he was Foreign Secretary. He was supposed to be doing an interview with his favourite political correspondent, Laura Koonsberg, and the interview was pulled. Why was it pulled, Jim?
Because she pressed the wrong button and sent the questions in advance to Boris Johnson.
I think that's just a remarkable mistake for her to make. She must have been mortified, Joe. Or was she mortified that she actually got caught sending the notes to Boris Johnson? That is the question,
I'm afraid
isn't it?
I'm not alone in my rather low opinion of Laura Koonsberg, who I think has never had the political gravitas of some of her predecessors, or indeed Chris Mason, who I think is an excellent political editor for the BBC, because you've got to combine the ability to explain quite complex issues in easy, accessible ways without dumbing down. And I think Chris does that very well. You've also got to be absolutely even-handed. And I think there's always been a slight concern that Laura Koonsberg has been far too close to the Conservative Party, and in particular Boris Johnson. Now, there are some wags around who suggest that actually what happened was that she sent the briefing notes to Boris Johnson and by mistake copied in her production.
Career wrecking. That is a really ridiculous suggestion. I mean, the idea that she would do that in advance, which would nullify the impact of her interview. It wouldn't be as punchy if he knew what the questions were. But I mean, if that's true, it's going to come out because that tight team of people around her will know the truth of the matter. But I think you're a little bit uncharacteristically there, Joe and Frank, in the world of conspiracies.
No, I just think, so why, if it was such a problem, he knew he was going to be asked about Partygate. He knew he was going to be asked about COVID. He knew he was going to be asked about Brexit. I mean, none of those things should be a surprise, even to Boris Johnson. The chances of him actually reading any briefing notes, of course, is another question. Would he have read anything anyway? And the question that then arises is, okay, so why didn't somebody else do it? You know, various people could have done the interview. Clive Myrie, for instance, Adam Bolton offered, former political editor of Sky. But then we had Sky's Beth Rigby. Their interview with Boris Johnson was pulled because she wasn't allowed to record it, bizarrely. I think it was an event at the Cheltenham Literary Festival. So, you know, you just sort of think, and actually, to be honest, who cares? We know what he did. We know what he'd say, and none of it has got any truth. And actually, it's fantasy or fiction, isn't it, if you were looking for it in a library?
Absolutely. I think the problem is, on a serious note, and who knows what happened with those notes that Laura Kuenssberg either advertently or inadvertently sent through to the former Prime Minister, is that there's an awful lot of us who just think that is too much of a coincidence. She has cozied up to Johnson in a very public way through documentary programmes that have been shown by the BBC. I've never felt that her interviews with him have been, to use your word, Joe, punchy, or particularly challenging. And I don't know whether I'd say she's close to the Conservative Party, but I do think that she had a personal relationship with Johnson that doesn't strike me as being professional. And I don't say that because I don't know Laura Kuenssberg from what I've seen her on the box. I've never been massively impressed with her. But I wouldn't say she's a Tory, but what I would say is she's always gone soft on Johnson. And therefore, when those notes were sent last week, as I say, it made me raise an eyebrow and think, oh, well, what a coincidence. The other point that Joe's made, and I think is one that I'd ask you about, Jim, actually, why didn't somebody else from the BBC just say, well, I'll step in and I'll do the interview instead?
Yeah, that's a fair point. But I'm afraid, you know, I don't want to prolong it, but I fundamentally disagree with you about the assessment about Laura Kuenssberg.
I'd have got Andrew Neil back because Boris loves talking to him. Anyway, yeah.
Perhaps you'd come on the Downtown Den podcast.
We wouldn't have him on.
No, well, interestingly, do you remember he was signed for GB News, never appeared? And do you remember, whilst we're talking about his book, his own memoirs, which he's knocked out fairly quickly, he was also given an £800,000 advance to write a biography of Shakespeare, which was supposed to come out on the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare, which, forgive me if I'm wrong, I think we have gone past that and the book's never appeared, and I'm not sure that the money's been handed back.
I'm sure it hasn't. But there you go. Listen, Boris, the saga rumbles on, and people will say to me, why are you still talking about that tosser? Well, because, as Jim indicated earlier, people like Tim Shipman and people who I spoke to who've been to the Conservative Party last week are saying that he's still a player within politics in this country. He might well make a comeback. So I think it's important that we remind ourselves of the absolute charlatan that he is. But there you go. We will end on that note. And we will see you all next week when we will be obviously talking about the Conservative Party leadership again and seeing how Morgan McSweeney has settled into his new job. See you next week. Have a great 7 days, everyone. Bye.